Hello and welcome to episode 143 of the Chills at Will podcast. It's a pleasure today to be joined by Neema Avashia. And a little bit about Neema. Neema Avashia was born and raised in southern West Virginia to Indian immigrant parents. She has been a civics and history teacher in the Boston Public Schools since 2003. She's the author of Another Appalachia, Coming Up Queer and Indian in a Mountain Place, which was published in March 2022. How are you today?
I'm great, Pete. How are you doing?
Good. Can we? I'm great. Thank you. And it's awesome to have you. Such an incredible read. Appalachian.
I'm glad you asked.
Please.
Anytime I get to do this, I'm really happy to do it. It's Appalachia.
Okay.
Like throwing an apple at you is how you say it.
Okay. Okay. Well, like I said, the bio does not in any way fully represent the greatness you've done. So we'll fill in some of those gaps because the book, which is going to be the main thrust of our conversation, is a lot autobiographical. Like I said, thanks so much for joining me. I'd love to hear about growing up and specifically about your writing, your reading life. I mean, were books a big part of your life, the printed word, and also language? You write in the book about Gujarati and wishing that you knew more. Was that your first language? Did you learn them both? What was kind of your parents' philosophy of teaching you Gujarati?
Yeah, I
Well,
mean, Gujarati was definitely my first language. And I think actually, and this is a story I think you'll hear from lots of children of immigrants. I went to India the summer before I started kindergarten.
okay.
And my parents had sort of like been exposing me to English also, but Gujarati was the main language spoken in our house. Then I went to India, I spent the summer there. And when I came back, I like didn't really have access to my English. Like
Mhm.
Gujarati had really sort of cemented itself, and my parents got kind of freaked out, and they were really
Uh,
worried that I was going to start school and like not have the language skills I needed to access the education
uh-huh.
in the kindergarten classroom in Cross Lanes, West Virginia, where like, you know, ESL services were not a thing. Like that didn't exist.
Uh-huh.
And so they actually got kind of scared and really pulled back on their emphasis of Gujarati because they were worried about the impact on my learning. And they still spoke it to each other. But there was a period of time where I think they really tried to be intentional about speaking English with me to
Mhm.
make sure I would do okay in school. I think the unintended consequence of that, and this is not their fault at all, is just that my Gujarati is like pretty elementary. Like my spoken Gujarati is fine. I can flow, but like reading and writing, I think I have like a third, second, maybe first grade level
Mhm.
ability to like decode. It really I am decoding when I read in
Right, right,
Gujarati,
right,
like,
right.
right? The comprehension is like it takes me a while to get to the comprehension.
Uh,
But in terms of English language books, my life was full of them from a really, really young age. I mean, my mom says she used to read to me when I was in the womb, and
hmm.
and uh, and I had an older sister who was 7 years older than I am, and so I think also I was following her a lot. So I would even when I was like very small, like 2 or 3, I was like practicing my letters in the carpet in our house, right? Like
Whoa.
that it was like just a really kind of word rich and language rich environment. And the thing that's funny about that is that the library in our town was it was like a pop-up library. There's another word
Mm.
for them, and I'm blocking on the word, but in the 70s, the United States government found funding to like put these very small libraries into rural communities. And they basically would pour a concrete slab and then they would build these particle board hexagon shaped things that were like little tiny libraries. Because before that, we had
Huh.
a bookmobile, right? We just had a,
Okay.
a bookmobile that would come around once a week and you would get books from that. But probably when I was five, yeah, 4 or 5, we got this permanent library and I read every book on the shelf
Hmm.
more than once. Like my mom would take me every week to the library. I would check out the max, whatever the rule was
Yes.
about how many you could take. I would check out
Yes.
the max. I'd take them home, and then next week I'd come back again and do it again. And it was not a very big library. So
Mhm.
I also was something that I call a repeat reader, which is I would read books again and again and
Oh
again
yeah.
and not tire of them. Partly because that was what was there, and
Mhm.
partly because I think I found a lot of comfort in that. So there were
Mm.
like certain series that I just read repeatedly, like my sister would get mad at me because I think I read the Little House on the Prairie series probably 100 times, right? Like every time she'd see me, she'd be like, "You're reading those books again?" And I'd be like, "Yeah, I can probably recite them by heart even now." And yeah, I think the interesting thing about it for me is that it wasn't like there was a lot of representation on those shelves. I wasn't finding books where I could like see myself directly represented, but I do think that part of reading for me was about accessing worlds beyond Crosslands, West Virginia. Like,
Mm,
are there other spaces and places and lives that I can imagine? And does that help me to sort of expand my understanding of what is possible beyond this very small town where we
mhm,
lived?
mm.
Um, but something that was really cool for me is I went home in April to do a reading at like my hometown
Oh,
bookstore,
wow.
and my childhood librarians were on in the audience,
That's
um,
cool.
who
That's
I
cool.
haven't seen since, I haven't seen them in probably 30 years. But I
Uh-huh.
think they knew how important they were in this journey. Like, I think it really felt like that to them, that like they were very aware that the
Mm.
library and they as librarians were such a part of shaping this very long process of getting to writing a book. And I didn't know they were going to be there. We hadn't talked about it, but it was really just a beautiful thing that kind of, I think, affirmed that idea of like how important books and stories and libraries have been in my life.
Oh, so cool. Wow. Yeah, to be able to read at the hometown library, the hometown bookstore, that's so cool. How small is Crosslands, like a suburb of Charleston, or is it like clearly like a small like, is it close enough to that quote unquote big city?
Yeah, it's about half an hour outside of Charleston.
Okay.
And yeah, it definitely functions as a suburb. It is not rural in the
Okay.
way that you imagine like farmland rural. Past Cross Lanes, it gets
Mm.
rural,
Yes.
but Cross Lanes is kind of like a bedroom community for
Okay.
sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Um, you were talking about ideas of representation. Like, when was it that you were able to recognize maybe not being represented? Like, could you have articulated that at 7 or 15 or 17 or?
I think what I could articulate as a young person was that any representation there was wrong. Right?
Mm,
So, like, you had Apu from The Simpsons, and I just felt angry when I watched The Simpsons, and, like, all of my friends were like, "This is the best show ever," and I was like, "I hate this show. I hate the way that it represents Indian people on the screen." Like,
mm,
although that is not what the show is about, like,
sure.
for me, that was the main takeaway I had from the show. Um, and that experience of like when you saw it, yeah, like when I saw myself represented, it was in very narrow and very stereotyped ways, right? So it was only a doctor or a convenience store owner. They always had a really heavy accent. Often they were white actors in brown face. Like
Mm,
there just was this set of characteristics that made me feel like this is not right. Um, and I ended up, I think, thinking about representation in almost a different way because I felt like the attempts at representation, or just like I wouldn't even say they were attempting representation, but the presentation of South Asian people in mainstream media just felt so wrong, and like often ended up having negative effects. Like kids would watch the Indiana Jones movies and then come back and ask all kinds of jacked up questions, right?
mm,
Like that I think I found representation of almost in like alternate spaces. So like I loved the X-Men comics when I was a kid.
mm.
Um and X-Men on the surface has nothing to do with being an Indian kid growing up in West
Mm.
Virginia, but underneath that feeling of like being proximate to belonging but never belonging, that feeling which is so salient among the X-Men of like we're kind of like you but we're not,
Mm,
is the thing that I found representation in, was in that
mm.
feeling.
No, very interesting. So as you continued to read, where did the writing come in? Were you, I guess, some maybe even some eureka moments about whether you're 11 or 21, like, I can do this, I got an award, or people really responded to it, or yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I started writing, I think, even like stories when I was in elementary school, middle school. Like I loved writing. When I was a teenager, I wrote for like our local paper had like a teen
Oh,
section, and so I wrote for like the teen section of the paper when I was a teenager. Um, but really, it wasn't until I got to college that I started to feel like, oh, I can do this, or like something, the things I'm saying have weight or have resonance or people are
mm,
responding to them. Um, that feeling for me really happened when I went to college.
Yeah. With, the name of the podcast is the Chills of Will podcast, the idea of the chills, the thrills that come from, reading those books 1,000 times, those ones you've had memorized, a line from a poem, those ones that give you the visceral feeling. Who are some of those writers, or what are some of those texts, whether they're in those, older times, or now, who just they're just go-tos, and you're just, stunned by the greatness of the writing?
Yeah, I mean, it's I guess probably an opportune time, but also just like a Salman Rushdie for me has
Mm.
been a writer who's been so important for so long. And I actually, my partner and I are having a baby in November, and I've been
Congratulations.
reading. Thank you. I've been
Oh,
reading the baby Haroon in the Sea of Stories, which is not the Rushdie book that most people
sure.
think of first, right? Midnight Children is the one everyone thinks of first, and I
Uh,
love Midnight Children. But Haroon in the Sea of Stories is one of my favorite books, and it has been since I was a teenager. And so
uh,
rereading it and just like sort of thinking about the ideas in that book, like I'm really loving it, and I'm loving the allegory,
hmm.
and thinking about this, especially in the context of like, he was writing this about Iran, but actually the sort of like idea of people who try to silence stories is so
Mm.
salient in the United States right now, that I find myself really moved and also kind of uh stunned by his prescience, and
Mm.
about this sort of like these efforts to silence stories are ongoing,
Right.
and are happening everywhere. And that is a book that, yeah, gives me a lot of chills back in the past and now also.
And so your daughter's gonna be hearing that one 7 or
She's
8
gonna be
times or 13
yeah,
times.
we're gonna read it a bunch of times. She's gonna know it. She's gonna know it really, really well.
That's a beautiful thing. Oh, man. So, you're an educator, you're a teacher, we talked about. I also started in 2003. Awesome to hear that. We've been, in the I hate saying in the trenches, because that's not true, but, that's the expressions we use. We've been in it for these almost 20 years now. I wonder how teaching informs your writing and vice versa, and like how I mean, have you always been writing and submitting throughout the years, or is that
No.
fairly recent phenomenon?
There was a long time when I didn't. I write in the book about an experience where my family got a hold of my senior thesis, which
Mm.
was not supposed to be something they were able to
Is that
read.
like JSTOR or one of those? You said
Yeah,
it's just through
like
a
they
Google
had put it
search.
like online, and did someone
Okay.
Google searched and they found it. And I didn't even know it was online, because when I graduated, you weren't putting
Right.
or undergraduate theses weren't online. They were,
Right.
whatever, printed and put in a basement somewhere.
Huh.
So after that experience of really people being very angry about my writing and my questions, it took me a really long time to write after that. There was a long time where I was not writing.
Hmm.
I couldn't, because of fear and shame, and just feeling like people didn't want my words.
Mm.
Um so really it was around 2015 that I started to write again.
Hmm.
And that was largely in response to the publication of Hillbilly Elegy.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
because I was living in Boston, and I was watching people up here pick up that book and say, like, this explains Appalachia, and this explains why people are voting the way they do. And I saw a book with the word hillbilly on the cover, and I got excited, because hillbillies are not a word that you hear people say in Boston, Massachusetts. And
Right.
I started reading, and very quickly was like, oh no, this book is
Uh,
not it. It is not. I don't recognize anything in this book. It's not people I know, it's not places I know,
uh-huh.
and it is a book that completely erased people like me.
Hmm.
There are no immigrants in that book. There are no black people in that book.
Right.
Although there are lots of immigrants and lots of black folks in Appalachia, they're erased, right? And I think that for the first time, when I read that book, I realized that, like, I had always thought about growing up Indian in Appalachia as this like niche experience that like no one would ever really understand. When I told people, they didn't believe me. They'd be like, "You're lying. You're not." No, there are no Indian people in Appalachia, right? That was a response.
Mm.
And so I had always just assumed like no one's gonna care about this story. And then when I read that book, I was like, wait a minute. If
Mm.
no one knows that story, they're just gonna keep believing this one. And so it really kind of felt to me like I it there was not going to be some magical moment where people recognized there were immigrants in Appalachia unless immigrants in Appalachia were writing their story.
Right.
Right? Like, I couldn't wait for somebody else to acknowledge my existence or my family's existence or
Yeah.
our history. I had to do that if I wanted it to be acknowledged. And so it really was in 2015 that I started writing really seriously and started to kind of think about what it would look like to put these stories on the page and to
Mhm.
try to render this experience of growing up
Mm.
in Appalachia. But I think the other part of your question about young people is I think I couldn't have written this book without the work that I do with young people. I think the way that this book is written, the kind of clarity
Mm.
is because I'm a teacher.
Hmm.
Like, I learned that clarity through teaching, right? Like, it is not a book that is like written in like extremely like abstract or literary language.
No.
Because that's not who I am as a person, and I'm not that way as a person because I'm a teacher. And I want you to understand what I'm trying to say. I don't want you to be confused when you walk away. I want it to be clear. In the same way that as a teacher, like, you want kids to walk away understanding what the lesson was about. So I
Mm.
think my work with young people informs the style of writing in the book. And I also think that working with young people and seeing what it is like when they don't have mirrors, when they can't find books that reflect them, or what it's like when they do find books that reflect them,
Mm.
also helped me to recognize the need for this book.
Hmm.
Which is that if you're a queer kid growing up in Appalachia, if you're a queer brown kid growing up in Appalachia, how many mirrors do you have? Right? I didn't have any when I was growing up. The first time I read a book that felt like a mirror was Good Talk by Mira Jacob. I
Mm.
was
Mm.
38 when
Yeah, that
that
book's
book
pretty recent.
came out,
Yeah, yeah.
right? And it was the first time where I was like, "Oh, this
Mhm.
is what it means," right? To have it be that somebody's experience and their questions line up so closely with your own.
Mm.
And that feeling coming so late and then seeing what that was like for the young people who I work with, right? When they found a mirror, definitely, I think, was a big impetus for being like, I have to have the courage to put this story out. Like, it's not enough to write the stories down. I need them to get out.
Mm.
Because kids in Appalachia need that mirror too.
So cool. It makes a lot of sense. I mean, what you're talking about, you're not dumbing it down, as a teacher, you're not dumbing it down, but you're making, like I said, more accessible. And that comes through in the book. I mean, it's not preachy, but it's for sure. I mean, there's a lot to be learned. There's a lot, like, not even morally, but historically, and all kinds of things. There's so much to be learned, but it's very accessible. Have you had students read the book? Have you had parents read the book, like the local community? Like, what's the response there?
Yeah, actually both. A lot of my students have read the book. There were some copies that were circulating in school, which was
Mm.
really cute.
All right.
They were very excited about the whole publication process. There was a
Uh-huh.
lot of drama around my launch day and like whether the books were going to come in time.
Oh
And there
no.
was the books were in Chicago. There was a storm. We were Google mapping how fast the books could get there. Kids were very, very excited about all of that.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, young people, I've also used some of the essays in the book with my kids. Like, I've used
I bet.
the hair essay is one in
Oh,
particular
okay.
that I think for a lot of students is one that they can really relate to.
Mm.
This idea of like figuring out your physical appearance as a part of figuring out your overall identity is, I think, a place a lot of kids can connect to. And so they've loved, I think, reading that essay. And in terms of parents, yeah, definitely some, when I did my launch, there were actually a lot of like Boston Public Schools community members, parents, former students, colleagues in that audience. And that was really, really lovely to kind of
Mm.
feel that affirmation from this community that I built in my time in Boston.
So cool. What are some of those books that have resonated with your students that have provided the mirrors for them?
I mean, whew, lots over
Lots.
time, some of which are like less popular now for many reasons. But I mean, one book that I think my students really love is Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by
Yeah.
Sherman Alexie. I mean, that is a book that I think for so many kids, they see themselves in it in lots of different ways, especially if you're a working class kid, no matter where you live. Like, I think there's just a lot of resonance for kids with that book. Um, that's one. I think that a lot of my students have loved Jason Reynolds' work, and really found a lot of
Mm.
joy in that.
Mm.
Elizabeth Aceveto's books,
Oh, okay.
The
Yeah.
Poet X is a big favorite of a lot of my students. Yeah, I mean, I think
Mm.
kids are hungry for those stories. Like they
Right.
really, really are hungry for them.
Right. Man, what do we do with Sherman Lexi's work? What do we do with
I
the
don't
work?
know.
You know,
I
because like you
know.
said, the work resonates so much.
It's
Ah,
like the kind of book that like it makes me sad to think about kids not reading that book.
I know.
And yet
Yeah.
also it's very complicated.
Right.
Um and I
Right.
think, my inclination around books is to say like, can you contextualize them? Like, so is it that we don't read it, right? Or is it that we read it and we read it in the context of kind of knowing the broader story?
Uh-huh.
Um, and I don't know the right answer all the time, but it is a thing I wonder about because especially in an era where book banning is becoming such a frighteningly popular thing to do,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
like part of me is very hesitant to take things off the shelf.
Sure.
Like I
Right.
just feel like do by doing that, do we like open the door to more of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a question I think we have to think
That's a
about. And
slippery, slippery slope. Yeah.
it's a very complicated thing and I don't know the answer, but I do know that like as an adult, right? Like I can read things by writers and also know that writers are fallible and that writers are human beings and that like as human beings who are fallible, like we do bad things, we make mistakes, we hurt people.
Mm-hmm.
Like that doesn't like I can hold those two things in my head at the same time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I do wonder as an educator if that's like part of my job too, is to help kids build the capacity to hold both of those things in your head at the same time. Someone can write something that you find really meaningful and really powerful, and they can also be someone who has caused harm, because all of us have the capability to cause harm,
Mm-hmm.
right? And would we be better off if we were in that conversation with kids as opposed to a conversation where it's really adults on all sides of this kind of being like, take this book down, take this book down, take this
Sure.
book down.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think
Yeah.
people might disagree with me. I'm not claiming I like know the answer, but I guess that's the question I think about.
Yeah. I think, yeah, obviously in agreement, just that the work is transcendent, incredible, and the deeds were horrific, you know.
Right. Yeah.
Uh, well,
Yeah.
thank you
And
for
there's a
that.
lot of that. Like,
Right.
there's a lot of that in our world,
Right.
unfortunately. Yeah.
Exactly. I want to talk about another Appalachia. Throwing Appalachia. Okay,
There
Appalachia.
you go.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Now you got
Coming up.
it.
Heck of a long title, but that seems to be the trend of these days, huh?
Hmm.
Lot of colons, a lot of but there's a lot going on in the title, and it lets you know what's going on. Um, I love you talked about a lot of it, but like the seeds for like making it a book, like when you kind of realize like these essays have that through line, how that worked.
I think that I didn't know.
Mm,
I think that people in my writing community knew before I did.
mm,
So there's a great writing nonprofit in Boston called Grub Street. And I have
mm-hmm.
taken lots of classes there. Part of the way that as a teacher, I figured out how to like make space for writing was like, I need deadlines and I need accountability and I need community or this isn't going to happen because
Yeah.
the to-do list as a teacher is endless, right? You could always be doing something and it wouldn't be writing.
Mm,
Um, and so in those writers workshops, really people who started to read my work, and people who I'd be in workshop with again and again kind of started to be like, there are themes and trends here, right? There are through lines that we're seeing, and we think you need to push them out further.
mm,
And so that was sort of like one space that was really important and helpful for me. And the other space that became really important for me is I went to the Kenyon Writers Workshop.
oh, cool.
Um, first as a student and then as a fellow. And I
Mm,
had the opportunity to work with an amazing mentor. Her name is Geeta Kotari. She's a essayist and a professor at Pitt. And having the opportunity to share work with her and for her to see my work evolve over the course of a
mm,
couple of summers and to be in that conversation about like, okay, here's what I see happening with your work. Um, and here's the direction I see it going in, made a really big difference.
mm,
I don't think that there was anything in me by myself that would have made me at some point be like, and now I have a book.
mhm,
I'm not that confident. And I think I would have just like kept circling around it without actually being like, and now I got to go in a direction. But having having colleagues and mentors who were sort of like putting that into my head again and again was a massive part of getting to the point where I was like, okay, no, I can do this.
Hmm.
And I need to do it. And people are telling me it's ready to go, then I gotta go with it.
Oh man. It's a beautiful start. The way you start the book is beautiful is the word. It's it's in second person. There's a lot of emphasis on like the vast emptiness of the town, right? Of your hometown. The little league that should be in season, but no one's there. A lot of physical manifestations of the flight, not the flight, I guess what would be the term, but
Yeah.
just like, right, like the emptiness, the kind of the barrenness of the town.
Yep.
um what made you decide to go second person? Because I know that's hard to do,
Yeah, it's a big swing, especially for the
right?
first essay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I knew that if I wanted this book to be something not just read by people in Appalachia, but also read by people outside of Appalachia,
Mm-hmm.
I needed to ground them in place
Mm-hmm.
first. Because
Yeah.
otherwise, like they would have no idea. Like most people have not been to Appalachia. The most people will say is like, oh, I drove through once, right, on the
Mm-hmm.
highway.
Mm-hmm.
So I couldn't figure out like either I was gonna have to like set up a place really early, or I was gonna end up doing a ton of work around place in every single essay.
Sure.
And when I was thinking about it, I mean, driving, when you're a kid who lives in a small place, driving is like such a big part of your experience
Mm.
and your identity is like you drive everywhere, right? And so I was trying to think about, and directions like are a big part of it. And especially in the days before Google, like people told you, they narrated how you went somewhere.
Mm.
And so I kind of was like, okay, if I want to really ground people in this place, I think I'm going to narrate the drive for them. Like
Uh-huh.
I'm gonna make them do the drive with me, right? I'm
Yes.
gonna have them experience that way of entering into the space, so that they can kind of see it exactly the way I see it in my head, and so that they're sort of grounded and located in place the way I would be.
Nailed it. Definitely nailed it for sure, man.